From DeciBio Consulting, I'm Stefan Budel.
And I'm Anthony De Benedetti.
And today we're speaking with Jessica Owens. Jessica started her career as a scientist at the CDC working in special pathogens, and since then has 20 years of experience as an investor, an entrepreneur in therapeutics and diagnostics, most recently as a co-founder of GRAIL.
Now she is a co-founder and partner at Initiate Studio, a venture studio at the intersection of healthcare, life sciences, and technology. We talk about their unique co-founding/investing approach and what, in her experience, makes for a successful life science venture.
We also touch on how digital biomarkers start to play into the precision medicine landscape, as well as a few lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. So with that, we'll take you to our conversation with Jessica. So tell us a bit about Initiate Studio and the goal, the vision, and what you have in mind with this studio.
Yeah. And so, as I mentioned, I had been an entrepreneur and I had started companies as a VC. So I was at Kleiner Perkins for a number of years, and we had started companies from scratch and, licensed technology and hired a team around them. We were also investing in early stage companies that had already been formed. But I think that's when I really fell in love with the idea of company creation, that you could create a company from some game-changing technology and get the right people around it to do something good. And so Initiate was really born out of this experience of both founding companies and, of course, investing in them. And so I had also founded companies outside of a venture studio and outside of a venture capital firm. And so as I paired up with a couple partners, so Yana Dimkova and Rowan Chapman are my partners in the studio, along with Randy Scott, who I had worked with at Genomic Health. And what we really wanted to do with the studio was create a platform for company creation where we could work with entrepreneurs and founders in a way that was really aligned with their interests. So not as venture capitalists, but actually as kind of co-founders, sharing in common stock and providing the companies with exactly what they needed. We have very flexible capital. We can structure our relationship with founders in a number of ways. But we're really attracted to big problems at the intersections of kind of healthcare, life sciences, and technology. So that kind of Venn diagram of those innovations coming together. And the studio piece, so there's kind of two parts to the model. There's the venture studio where we partner with founders to start companies. And then Yana and I are out also raising a fund to go alongside it. And so we will be then funding the companies that come out of the studio from that vehicle. And so that was kind of the thinking around it was, I was looking to go back to investing, but I didn't want to stop creating either. And I figured after all the bumps and bruises and all my learning along the way, I could hopefully help others not take the same spills and tumbles and guide them to getting to that Series A and getting that first big financing locked in with some of the things that I had learned. And so that's our model. We co-found with entrepreneurs. We help them get to that first priced round. And then we leverage our network to put together, the syndicate and introduce, to venture capitalists who would lead the round. And then also, of course, we intend to, back companies over their entire life cycle. So we will invest out of the fund vehicle in that first round.
There are a lot of studios and incubator and et cetera, accelerators out there. Can you tell us a bit about how Initiate is different and why it is that you decided to start it now?
Our studio is different in a couple ways, I would say. First, we're not a volume shop, so we don't have a class. We don't have 15 companies we're working with at the same time. We really wanted to be selective about the projects that light us up and interest us, and the people, of course, who drive those projects. And so, one differentiation is that we really focus. So, when you work with us, you work with one of us as your kind of lead partner, and typically you would have a second who's kind of running backup. And our model is really to just roll up our sleeves and partner in the sense that, like, in the way a co-founder would, to map out, what are the market segments, who should we approach first? Let's go through our Rolodex and, figure out who we can call for some market research, or, we could engage DeciBio as a firm to do that market research. Exactly. And so the goal being that we spend and focus our time on one to two projects at a time. And so that gives us, I think, a lot of ability to just add value in a different way than kind of an accelerator or, historical incubators that have classes. The other thing that we bring that's unique, and I think you're starting to see more of these popping up, is that we also bring capital. And so it's not just like, here's the way you build a pitch deck. It's really, what do we need to get done? What does the budget require? And if we need to, pay $100,000 for a huge market study or do something like that, we're able to. If we need to pay for IP that needs, we're able to. And so it's really all about what does the company need to get itself packaged up and really prepared to go out and capitalize on an opportunity after they secure that first round of financing.
Let's talk a bit about the technology and the healthcare spaces or healthcare development that you think might have the most impact. Like, is there any space in particular that you guys are looking at to invest, or any space in particular that you think is extremely exciting?
Yeah, so maybe I'll give you kind of the general buckets, and then we can talk and drill down a little bit inside of them. So I would say we see the world in kind of three buckets. One is the technologies and tools and services that advance pharmaceutical and biotech development. And so those aren't necessarily compounds or, assets that are being advanced themselves, but more supporting platforms and technologies. And so we have a whole practice area around pharma services. And we have actually a company in the studio that we are working with now that is building a rare disease CRO, which kind of comes with the appreciation that in this day and age, rare diseases actually make up, 25% of disease out there. They're just individually rare. But when you put them all together, the needs of pharma companies and biotech companies developing drugs for smaller patient populations is really more about the delivering on the promise of the personalization and precision medicine, right? And so as you see the ability to hone in on, a very specific mechanism of action, you also have, going along with that, the need to be able to find those patients and conduct those studies. And there's actually a great deal that all of the rare diseases have in common when it comes to how you conduct a trial. And so this rare disease CRO we're working with is really deploying some of the kind of, there's kind of the old school CROs, then you have the decentralized CROs. And this is kind of like, this is all of the best in class collection of real world data and, being able to have expertise in recruiting patients from across a very, very broad landscape, when you're kind of looking for a needle in a haystack. So that's one we're really excited about in the I would say, pharma services side. But that could also be in that bucket we would call any, a target discovery platform or an, AI ML driven type of antibody discovery platform, things like that. So that's all the pharma services business. The second bucket I would describe as tools and diagnostics. And, these are the GRAILs of the world. Randy Scott has been a founder 3 times and taken companies public, believe Insight, Genomic Health, and Invitae, right? So that fits very squarely. Yeah, not a bad track record. Andy's an amazing person. And so that's an area that we're really excited about. And you mentioned oncology. There's so much going on in oncology, but I think what has been very interesting about the pandemic is it has heightened all of our awareness of the importance of diagnostics and precision medicine and the clinical actionability of that information and having the right information in the right time. I think that's something that, to me, creates an entire tailwind for the industry. I'm very interested in the decentralization of testing. So getting the right test to the person who needs it in the right moment, not having to wait 14 days for it to, be mailed off and then brought back. And I think the other thing that's really interesting is now we have seen what's happened in oncology, and it's happened for a number of reasons. But there's a lot of really interesting work happening in immune-mediated inflammatory diseases and areas that are outside of oncology where precision medicine actually has the power, I think, not just to help patients who maybe need different drugs, but also in the facilitation and development of new drugs by identifying these patient populations. So that's an area we're really excited about. And I could talk about that area for a long time. But, slowly but surely, we are going to reach the day where we will actually be delivering on this kind of futuristic promise of being sequenced when you're young and, knowing that you have potentially certain, potential, drug reactions, and knowing that certain risk factors are more important for you to pay attention to. And so we're kind of, stepping back into that. I think we've seen it with carrier screening and NIPT, and, these newborn testing paradigm today is in need of a pretty massive overhaul. But, we will be marching towards that vision, I think, over the next few decades. And that's really, really exciting.
How do you start to think about, communicating? I think one thing that we've also seen during the pandemic is that the scientific community can sometimes have a challenge with communicating to a broader audience that doesn't have an understanding of the scientific principles underneath it. So, when you start thinking about things like, broad genomic testing, universal NIPT, stuff like that, how much of the thought process is, okay, how do we also start to think about this in a way that it becomes accessible to a non-scientific community, to patients who don't necessarily have any understanding or even interest in the science behind it?
Yeah. I think you make an excellent point. And I think that this is a shift in our industry that I think every company who is a life sciences company needs to actually take pretty seriously, because I think as a whole, the industry has lagged in its, how shall I say this, savviness in communicating with just people. We've come a long way in the industry, and yet, we know that people want to be called people, not patients, right? And and that, that's something that, I guess pharma stood up and noticed that, 5-10 years ago, but still yet we refer to patients all the time. And it turns out we're all just people, and nobody really wants to be a patient. And that's just kind of a role that we play in our lives as people, is sometimes we happen to be also patients. And so I think it's something that there's such a room for improvement. And you see in companies that actually have been quite successful during the pandemic that they have been able to do this well. And so I guess 23andMe obviously was in the lead, right, for a decade, right, ahead of other people, figuring out how to communicate with consumers. I'm still just a fan of people, because we don't necessarily need to be consuming anything to be actually learning and growing and understanding our way of the way the ecosystem works. I think the other thing that's just a hard and real thing to overcome is that, as of a few years ago, the pharmaceutical industry was kind of right next to big tobacco with respect to the, the trust of the public, and
or lack thereof.
Yeah, and which is really kind of sad. As I was sitting here watching this pandemic unfold, I thought, wow, the private sector is actually going to save us, right? Innovation is going to be the remedy when this thing all plays out, and we will get this to, it's not going to go away, but we'll get it to a point where we can coexist with this virus. And it's interesting that I think there has not been more effort on the part of the pharmaceutical companies to humanize this a little bit, and I guess we're all in a hurry, right? Like everyone is just rushing, and God praise the vaccine developers. I'm looking forward to getting my booster when it's my time. And I will have my children, first in line to get their vaccines as soon as they are able to. And it has been humbling to have little kids in this, and to know that, we have to continue to keep them safe and keep them, isolated as best we can, and not isolated, but, 6 feet apart, and they're still all wearing masks. And so I'm a big fan of actually people who are wanting to do the work of figuring out how to communicate with people as people and not just patients.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really important part of how to move the trust in pharmaceutical companies, but we have a long way to go. The Sackler trial in the background is not helping. It's just, there's so much to overcome. And so I think it's just an important part of every company's strategy is what is your communication strategy? Because it matters.
I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on point of care testing. I was just in the UK for a couple of months. I was actually quite impressed with the point of care testing and like the antigen test that they're doing there. And you can tell a lot of people are taking a lot of these tests. Like I don't know the exact numbers. I wouldn't be surprised if hundreds of millions of tests have been taken like worldwide for antigen testing. And do you think that essentially this pandemic, if there is one silver lining, is that it helped people better understand the premise of precision medicine and the type of test that you can do in order to better understand your body? Do you think that is something that's going to stay with us in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it's a little bit of people have to kind of take the leap from infectious disease to what are all the other things that tests tell us? What kind of information does this? What change in clinical action does this information provide, right? And with coronavirus, it's very clear, right? There's all these guidelines, and you get a positive test or you get a negative test, and you go down the decision tree, right? But I think it's important for patients to people to realize that when they're in a hospital or in the same thing is happening every single time you get a blood reading or people are making decisions down decision trees based on the information that comes from those tests. And I think that there will be much more, acceptance generally of home testing, things you can do in your own home monitoring, just because we've been taught how to do it. Companies like Vault and Everlywell, even LabCorp, right? You can order home tests for COVID in the US and swab yourself and send them in. And I'd love to get to the day. I was joking with my husband where I said, it would be just so convenient if we had a PCR machine in our house. I was like, I know how to work them. Like it's not, it's not that hard. Obviously you don't want to be doing pipetting in your kitchen table. But I think that technology is getting to the point where, companies are now deploying products that are, PCR quality tests, in a box. And so we'll see more and more of those coming to the market.
Yep.
For any number of uses.
Yeah, agreed. So I'm assuming that you already mentioned you're excited to invest in some of these spaces. And is there any specific ingredient for success that you're looking for, either in the people, in the technology, or can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So for me, I would start with people first. I guess from, doing this for so many years, every company, every project, in fact, hits, speed bumps and unexpected challenges along the way. And, I think that one of the most important criteria in continuing to have the resilience to keep moving is to have a founder who believes, right? There's that sense of, I can make this work, we'll figure this out. I think that's crucial to the success of a company. And I really like companies where the founder has been in maybe a startup. It doesn't have to be, but maybe having been in a startup, you kind of know that the ups and downs are totally normal, right? This would happen at GRAIL a lot, right? We were a startup and we would recruit somebody from a place like Genentech or Google, like wonderful companies. And people would like 2 weeks in, you'd have a one-on-one with someone and you'd say, how's it going? How are you feeling? You doing all right? And they're either like, yeah, this is exciting. Or they're kind of like white knuckled and they're like, is this what it's like? And you're like, yeah, this is totally normal. Totally normal to be in a startup and feel like it's like, because you're moving fast. And that's I think the important tension. So people are, for me, the most important ingredient in a startup, because people can make things work, right? People can change strategy. People can shift out a product. Great people can carry a business. So that's number one. Number two, I really think that we are on the verge of, technologies that were technologies we might have backed 5 to 10 years ago, now looking at them and saying, this is great, but how does the infusion of data platforms, digital platforms, and data itself enable kind of a step function in what we could do before? And so those are things that I'm looking at really closely, is like, what is the technical kind of angle on this that changes and unlocks a completely new opportunity? And so that's a really important piece of the studio, right? We're looking for technology informed solutions that will scale, as our ability to look at data and analyze it scales. And so that's to me, a crucial piece. And I think when you've been in healthcare for a long time and you've seen also a lot of data, it's like, it's not just data for data's sake. If you look at like applications of artificial intelligence models on large data sets that have great promise, they're actually data sets where you know some things. It's not just a big messy mess of data, right? I saw this really interesting thing where they were looking at the way that they were analyzing a certain organ of the body, and their AI ML models could pick up and figure out, was this a woman or a man? In which they were, and it was like, it was like looking at a liver. I can't remember exactly what it was looking at, but I thought, wow, that's incredible. But then, it occurred to me, but they have ground truth. They know whether it's a woman or a man. And so I think what gets really interesting is when these models can start to be populated and in a way with such robust data that you can start to learn new things, kind of without necessarily having, a hypothesis. So I think that's really the future. I think today, a lot of this work is still very hypothesis driven, and it has to be for a number of reasons. But I see, in the decades that come, actual discovery inside of data sets that can be less hypothesis driven and more based on, applying analysis in ways that illuminates things that we couldn't see before. And I think that's really cool.
Agreed. And there is like a number of companies that are very exciting right now that have very high valuations where you can tell the value is in the data, it's in the information. And I think Foundation Medicine early on was very, very successful because of that. And they knew it. It's like a lot of people can do sequencing, but if you can start to also link it to outcome data, et cetera, it becomes highly valuable. And on that point, I think that's something else that's going to be interesting is try to see how digital biomarkers can actually start to add value. And we may have discussed that in the past, but I think it was Bing, the search engine, that could detect a couple of months before a person make the first appointment to the doctor that they had pancreatic cancer, just simply based on the search results and what they were searching, the time they spent on pages, et cetera. So it's going to be, do you think that this interaction between digital biomarkers and actual wet lab biomarkers is going to take place over the next decade or 2 decades?
Yeah, I do. It's actually really, I'm so interested in this space, and I think it's completely feasible and doable. What strikes me about it is that the development of digital biomarkers really isn't all that different than the development of any kind of biomarker, right? You're looking for, if it's a pattern in the blood of a certain analyte, right? You're looking for that pattern, and you're looking for classifiers that pull two groups apart, right? And I think what will really drive this field forward is when you have companies with this very, very strong data and computer science strategy behind them, but you also marry them up with clinical developers who have done this kind of development before. Because it's the number one thing I see is, and you see it all the time, that the training sets aren't quite set up properly, that there's there's this thing, but then, to reproduce it, you actually do need to have, a structured trial. And so you can imagine when, if it's something passively collected on our phone, I would imagine there's probably hundreds of things we can learn from the way we interact with our phone. And of course, there's a number of companies working in this space, but you could marry that up with an entire episode of care, right? So you could pick your disease, pick your unmet needs. And what you have is, your phone with you, which is passively collecting information about how you're doing in between doctor visits. And I would be surprised if you couldn't predict all kinds of things from that. But they just have to be studied in a prospective way, right? So it's back to science 101, which is you have a hypothesis, you have to set up an experiment, and then you have to test it, right? And so I'm very excited about this space, and I hope to see more companies going after some of these these episodes of care that actually what happens when you're home is expensive and meaningful, right, for a patient.
Yep.
Is there a like single piece of wisdom or guidance that you kind of find yourself giving or attempting to give to early stage founders while they're, trying to figure out applications, while they're engaged with you, that, just is like, I've been here, I know you need to do this, and for some reason it's just, hard to get through?
I think the thing that I tend to focus on maybe more than other entrepreneurs, just because of the roles I've held in companies, is so I led marketing at GRAIL, and I led really the building out of the commercial team. And what that really meant was a lot of the research that went into how does the product have to work? So the voice of the customer in your product. And I think in a healthcare ecosystem where there's so many stakeholders, sometimes the product and the customer, it gets confusing. Like, who are you even serving, right? Who are you serving with this? And I think that keeping your stakeholders and who are the stakeholders, who are the influencers, who are the decision makers, who are the buyers, the users, it's a framework I don't see deployed very often and very early in health tech companies. And I think it actually could, companies spend, millions of dollars, and sometimes, their entire seed to A is used learning about their customers and pivoting their business. And I think you can get a lot of that, not all the way, but you can get a lot of that done early. You can figure out who are your best fit customers and figure out what do they care about and what do they not care about. And really build your business with a customer first mindset, who a deep analysis of your customers. Because I just see companies get way too far down the road, and they don't, they see what their widget is cool, but their customer thinks, well, if I could just use it this way, couldn't I use it over here? And if it did this other thing. And so I think, talk to as many customers as you can. I think oftentimes people save, they're like, oh, well, I want to go pitch that person. It's like, go talk to that person before you pitch that person. Because getting that right is what's going to make your product sticky and make customers keep coming back. So that's kind of my mantra. I'm always kind of pounding the drum of, who's it's amazing how many times you talk to somebody, and I'm, guilty of it myself. Who's the decision maker? And is that person the same person as the user? And what are the incentives of everyone who surrounds that decision? And we have a really cool, company working on some tools for making data more usable, like automating parts of data cleaning and auditing that process so that you can go back and look, and really getting let your engineers do the analysis, getting, up-leveling them to the more interesting work. And that's a huge promise, right? For every company right now is grappling with how do we use our data in a way that is driving our business forward. And but it's interesting when you go inside these different companies. You can imagine, go to pharma, go to CROs, go to diagnostics companies. The decision makers are slightly different inside each of those companies, and where they are with respect to how they use data in their day-to-day business really drives kind of whether they see this as a must-have or a nice-to-have. And so, just really getting in there and talking with a lot of people, it may seem laborious at, when you're kind of itching to get to market, but I think, you can spend a couple extra months in the beginning to save yourself, an extra year in the end.
Yeah.
So, so I'm a big fan of getting out there and really thinking about the world through the lens of solving customer problems.
So maybe pivoting a little bit, I want to talk some more about one of the third pillar, or one of the third point that you made around the interest that Initiates had in its investments, and it's around the immune system. It's actually I'm a neuroscientist by training, but the immune system I think is absolutely fascinating, and Adaptive is obviously going after it. I think Chad, their CEO, is very inspirational in the way he talks about how the immune system has a memory, and so with a single blood draw, you can understand not only what's happening in a person's body right now, but what happened in the past. What did that person fight in terms of cancer, infectious disease, autoimmune disease, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So can you maybe comment a bit on what's the angle that you guys have, if one in particular, and what makes the immune system and immunology exciting for you?
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple things. I do love that perspective that you can kind of look back in time and have a way to create signal or evaluate and observe signal that gives you a historical view on what has happened in the body. I would say that my interest in the area, I think on one level comes from a personal interest, which is not myself, but that I know so many, frankly, women who have kind of autoimmune inflammatory disease of not sure origin. And, this is my symptoms. I have these things, I have, not me, but I have these things on my hands, and then I have joint pain. I'm kind of surprised by how many people I know who just kind of live with something that they realize there's an immune component, but they don't want to get onto these very, those drugs are real deal big drugs with side effects. And so it's kind of like watch and wait for this thing to get better or worse. And if it gets worse, we'll do something about it. Or it may be that we figure out that you have lupus. But right now, the diagnostic testing is, there's not a lot that they can do. And there are a couple companies working in this space. There's a company called Cypher. Of course, Adaptive is doing a ton of work related to oncology. But I do think this is kind of the next big horizon in terms of drug development and, common shared pathways in these immune-mediated diseases, right? Inflammatory diseases. And frankly, developing drugs that are more are targeted towards things that probably we don't quite totally understand yet about the physiology and mechanics of the disease. So I just see this as kind of a wide open space, and a lot of the they're big patient populations, right? That's another important piece to me is like, how big is this market and how meaningful of an impact can you make? And so there's a whole laundry list of kind of debilitating immune mediated diseases like RA and lupus and many, many rare ones. And so I see this as an area where a lot of good can be done. And so I'm looking very broadly at this space. I don't have yet, I think this is a sequencing solution, but mostly right now looking at kind of what's out there and where are there still big pockets of unmet need to go after.
Thanks for listening. And thanks again to Jessica for joining us.
Music for this episode was provided by Javier Suarez. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn or visit our website at DeciBio.com for more insights on precision medicine.